Captain Kes Vander had learned long ago that silence was a weapon like any other, which explained why the observation deck of the Archon station fell away when her presence became known. The human officer moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had spent 30 years perfecting the R control restraint, her gray eyes carrying particular exhaustion that came from making decisions others wouldn't dare consider. She chose a position at the viewport that faced away from the main thoroughfare, a small alcove that offered solitude without the appearance of isolation, and settled into the contemplative stillness that had become her refuge. The uniform covering her broad shoulders bore the insignia of someone who had lost more command battles to politics than to actual combat, testament to another week of navigating the impossible terrain between military necessity and bureaucratic compromise. The observation deck offered something Kes's office never could, the freedom to exist without the performance of authority. Here, watching the slow rotation of distant planets and the surgical precision of station-keeping thrusters, she could be something other than Captain Vander, the pragmatist, the officer whose willingness to make unpopular decisions had made her simultaneously indispensable and deeply resented. She watched the merchant vessel depart, its engines leaving a faint luminescence against the black. 3 cargo shipments had been rerouted this week because of her recommendation. The supply depot would face a supply shortage. The planetary colony would have to ration medical supplies for another month, but the Archon station would maintain the fuel reserves necessary to respond to Meridian sector crisis if it escalated further. The mathematics of scarcity and triage never grew easier to solve. The observation deck's main entrance slid open with barely audible pneumatic hiss, and Kes's hand moved instinctively toward the data tablet at her hip before she registered the unhurried gait of someone who belonged here. Dr. Nolan Chun entered carrying a small botanical specimen in a clay pot, his attention focused on the delicate plant with the kind of concentration usually reserved for surgical procedures. Unlike most personnel who would alter their course upon noticing her presence, he simply acknowledged her with a slight nod, the same minimal gesture he might give to any colleague sharing a communal space, and moved to a corner position near the opposite viewport, where he began arranging his botanical equipment on a small maintenance table. Kes watched him work, waiting for the inevitable moment when he would recognize her rank or her reputation and find an urgent need be elsewhere. Everyone knew the stories. Captain Vander's testimony that had ended Admiral Khalifa's career when she refused to corroborate his version of events at Kepler Station. The incident with the medical director who had attempted to redirect hospital supplies to civilian contractors and discovered that Kes's interpretation of procurement regulations was both thorough and merciless. The diplomat who had suggested her tactical recommendations prioritized military objectives over humanitarian concerns and learned that Kes was equally capable of defending her moral framework as her strategic one. But Nolan continued his botanical work with serene focus, occasionally adjusting the specimen's position to catch the distant starlight more directly. His presence was neither obsequious nor challenging, simply professional acknowledgement that they occupied the same space with no inherent conflict in that arrangement. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft sounds of Nolan's work with soil and seedlings and the distant hum of the station's life support systems. After 15 minutes, Kes realized she was waiting for him to speak, to ask about her presence here, to acknowledge the weight she carried, or offer the kind of empty condolences that made difficult situations worse. He didn't. Nolan finished arranging his specimen and moved to a portable growth analysis device, connecting various sensors to the plant with the methodical care of someone conducting delicate research. His approach was organized without being obsessive, practical without being cold. When he needed to consult his notes, he did so on a small data screen that he angled away from her viewport without deliberate rudeness, simply the courtesy of not allowing reflected light to interfere with her view of the stars. For the first time in weeks, Kes felt something in her chest loosen slightly. The rigid posture she maintained in the command center, shoulders squared, spine aligned, ready to absorb the constant pressure of decision-making, softened into something that resembled natural rest. She was still alert, still aware of the security protocols and emergency procedures that governed the observation deck, but the constant state of readiness that had become her baseline felt marginally less oppressive here. Newer specimen, Nolan said quietly, more to himself than to her, his attention still on the delicate plant. Remarkable resilience in low-nutrient conditions. Can't explain it by any known botanical principle, but it grows stronger under conditions that should kill it. It wasn't directed at Kess, required no response, and somehow felt more honest than most conversations she'd engaged in across 3 decades of military service. No acknowledgement of her rank, no careful navigation around her reputation, no questions about classified decisions or strategic choices. Just a scientist talking to himself about impossible plants while she contemplated the weight of impossible decisions. Kess found herself listening to the rhythm of his work, the soft beep of diagnostic sensors, the occasional satisfied sound he made when a measurement aligned with his expectations, the gentle sound of water being misted onto delicate leaves. It was peaceful in a way she'd nearly forgotten existed, like observing some essential process that continued regardless of her presence or approval. When Nolan finished his work and began to prepare his equipment for transport, Kess expected him to depart with the same quiet efficiency he'd maintained throughout his stay. Instead, he paused near his collection of botanical tools and glanced at the newer specimen with obvious affection. "These shouldn't grow as well as they do," he said, his tone carrying particular wonder of someone who spent his life studying exceptions to established rules. "We understand resilience better in theory than in practice. Try to protect plants too much, they weaken. Leave them entirely unprotected, they break. But find the exact point where stress becomes growth rather than damage. That's where real development happens." He left without ceremony, and Kess realized she'd been holding her breath without knowing why. The observation deck felt different now. Not empty exactly, but arranged, as if the space had been prepared for someone who needed to see it from a particular perspective. Dr. Nolan Chun had spent 20 years developing what he privately termed his unofficial theory of human resilience, and his current working hypothesis was that Captain Vander needed to exist in places where her decisions had no immediate consequences, where she could observe systems operating according to physics rather than politics. He'd noticed her in the observation deck 3 times over the past month, always in this particular corner, always with the bearing of someone who was currently off duty, but could never quite fully disable command instincts that had become her baseline. The botanical garden had been closed for renovations Nolan had deliberately extended over this particular week, which meant the observation deck had become his backup research location. The timing coincidence was only partially accidental. By his calculations, Captain Vander gravitated toward the space during weeks when the command rotation was most demanding. The correlation was sufficiently strong that he begun timing his own work accordingly. He was not attempting to help her. Help implied that he understood what she needed, and Nolan had learned that offering unsolicited assistance to traumatized military officers usually resulted in polite rejection and increased isolation. Instead, he was simply occupying the same space with his own legitimate work, the way one organism might grow in the presence of another, without either one requiring the other to function. By the 5th visit, Nolan had reorganized his equipment, so that his most detailed work happened during hours when he'd observed her in the observation deck. By the 7th, he'd begun mentioning his specimens with particular clarity, speaking aloud about their conditions and characteristics in a way he might not have of alone. By the 9th, he arrived with 2 insulated containers of what could charitably be described as herbal tea, setting one on the maintenance table where she might notice it, the other near his own workspace. "Station dispensing units make terrible tea," he'd said that day, entirely to himself, as he prepared his cup. "I've found that most people benefit from something that tastes less like recycled thermal regulation fluid." Captain Varden had not touched the tea the first time. By the 3rd visit, the cup would be empty when he arrived. On the 15th visit, Nolan found her already in the observation deck when he arrived, standing with her back to the viewport, examining a data tablet with a focus intensity that suggested she was processing something more significant than routine reports. "Difficult week?" he asked, the first question he'd posed to her directly in all their shared time at the observation deck. It was casual enough to seem spontaneous, non-invasive enough to allow her to ignore it entirely. Kess looked up, and something in her expression suggested she was deciding whether to tell him the truth. "The colony supply shortage I recommended last month has resulted in 3 preventable deaths. Medical supplies were delayed by the rerouting." Nolan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he moved to his usual workspace and began unpacking his botanical equipment, giving her silence in which to either continue or withdraw. The newer specimen from his previous work had begun developing a secondary growth pattern. Unusual, possibly indicating adaptive response to the low nutrient conditions. He began measuring the new growth with careful attention. How many lives were saved by the fuel reserve you maintained? He asked eventually, still focused on botanical measurements. Projections suggest the additional fuel capacity prevented potential casualties in the Meridian sector, Kess replied, the clinical language of someone referencing official reports. But projections aren't certainty. 3 definite deaths versus theoretical lives saved. That's not a calculation that's ever equal. No, Nolan agreed, connecting his analysis equipment to the plant specimen. Life-death equations never balance. But the mathematics aren't the only variable, are they? There's something about the decision itself. The fact that you were willing to carry the weight of those 3 deaths to prevent an unknown number of others. That's not a failure of your decision-making process. That's evidence it's functioning correctly. Kess was quiet, processing this. Explain that. The worst military decisions I've studied in history came from officers who treated casualties like budget line items, Nolan said. Pure mathematics, no moral weight. They could make their choices with absolute certainty because they'd already decided the human cost didn't matter. But you're still carrying those 3 deaths, which means you understand exactly what you spent when you made that choice. Something in Kess's expression shifted, not resolution exactly, but a subtle settling, as if someone had identified a weight she'd been attempting to carry alone and confirmed that the weight was real. They fell into a rhythm after that conversation. Nolan would arrive with his botanical specimens. Kess would eventually appear at her preferred viewport, and they would occupy the observation deck together with a kind of companionable parallel focus that didn't require constant conversation. When Nolan needed to discuss his research, he would describe what he observed, the unexpected growth patterns, the resilience of species that shouldn't survive, the principles of stress and adaptation that seem to operate as much in plants as in military officers. Kess would listen and occasionally ask clarifying questions, but the dialogue remained light, professional, free from a weight that characterized her interactions in the command center. On the 23rd visit, Kess brought coffee, not the terrible station dispensary coffee, but something from a personal supply that tasted like choice rather than circumstance. She set a cup near his workspace with the same careful casualness with which he'd offered his tea months earlier. The colony receiving the delayed supply shipment has established a memorial for the 3 individuals who didn't survive, she said. They named the medical facility after one of them, a doctor named Rashid who had been planning to retire to his family's home before the shortage forced his departure to this colony. Nolan accepted the coffee without comment, the way he accepted her presence, as a fact requiring acknowledgement only through quiet appreciation. Do you know what he was planning to do there? Teach, Kess replied. His family wanted him to work with their children, pass on medical knowledge. Instead, he spent his final months rationing supplies in a colonial medical facility. He still passed on knowledge, Nolan observed. The medical facility that was named after him. How many people will train there? How many of those people will remember his name and his choices when they make their own impossible decisions? Kess met his gaze directly. You're telling me that 3 deaths was acceptable because of the theoretical future benefit. No, Nolan said carefully. I'm telling you that 3 deaths was terrible, unacceptable, and the consequences of your decision prevent a larger catastrophe. You're not responsible for the fact that catastrophes require sacrifice. You're responsible for making the choice that results in the smallest total sacrifice possible given imperfect information. And you did that. And I'll carry those 3 faces for the rest of my life, Kess said quietly. Yes, Nolan agreed. You will. And because you will, the next time you're faced with similar impossible choice, you'll remember what the cost actually feels like, and you'll make sure you're spending that cost on something genuinely worth the price. That's not a flaw. That's wisdom earned through experience. The observation deck became more than a research location over following weeks. It became a sanctuary neither of them had explicitly agreed to maintain, but both understood was irreplaceable. Station personnel began to recognize the pattern. Captain Vander's presence on the observation deck during certain days meant Dr. Chen would be conducting his botanical research in that location rather than the botanical garden. and the atmosphere shifted from public space to something more like a carefully curated refuge. When Lieutenant Morrison needed to check the observation deck's environmental seals, he did so quickly and quietly, speaking in hushed tones as if afraid to disturb some delicate process. When maintenance technician Yuki needed to replace a viewport module, she worked with the careful consideration of someone in a library rather than a workspace. Neither of them commented on the two figures occupying different corners of the observation deck, the officer at her viewport and the scientist with his plants, but both seemed to understand they were witnessing something worth protecting. Nolan realized they had inadvertently created something rare on a military station, a place where rank mattered less than mutual understanding, where the legendary Captain Vander could exist as simply Kess, even if neither of them used her first name in actual conversation. The botanical specimens thrived in the observation deck's particular environment. The neuroplant that Nolan had brought for his ongoing resilience study had developed not just a secondary growth pattern, but tertiary developments that suggested adaptation to conditions that should have been fatal. He documented the growth with meticulous attention, while Kess monitored the station's long-range communications and occasionally made observations about ship movements in neighboring sectors. Your species and my plants operate on similar principles, Nolan mentioned one afternoon, testing a new nutrient mixture on a dendritic specimen. Stress creates growth, but too much stress creates damage. The key is existing in that specific range where challenge exceeds comfort, but destruction remains theoretical. That's not a very encouraging philosophy, Kess observed, watching a cargo vessel depart through the viewport. It's not meant to be encouraging, Nolan replied. It's meant to be accurate. Comfortable people rarely develop resilience, but people subjected to overwhelming pressure break rather than grow. Command requires you to exist in that narrow band where you're constantly challenged but not yet destroyed. It's exhausting. It's unsustainable, Kess corrected gently. Probably, Nolan agreed, but so is asking for transfer. So is delegating the difficult decisions to people less capable of making them. So you exist in the sustainable unsustainability of a narrow band, and occasionally you come to the observation deck to remember that other systems also operate on the principle of necessary stress. Kess smiled. Is this the official Dr. Chen therapeutic botanical philosophy? Very unofficial, Nolan said. Wouldn't survive peer review, but it seems to be helping, so I haven't submitted it for publication. It is helping, Kess confirmed quietly. More than you might realize. The emergency alert that interrupted their routine came as a classified communication to Captain Vander's personal terminal. A cargo transport carrying critical medical supplies had been interdicted by an unauthorized vessel in the Meridian sector. The transport's distress signal indicated they were equipped only for light defense. The Archon station had one viable response option: deploy a military frigate with a small tactical team, with estimated arrival time of 14 hours. The problem was that the frigate was currently undergoing critical maintenance and would not be combat ready for another 18 hours under optimal conditions. The alternative was to reroute additional resources from station operations, delaying completion of essential repairs, and creating a cascading series of secondary supply shortages that would affect multiple departments over the following month. Or authorize the transport to attempt independent evasion, which would likely result in cargo loss and possible crew casualties. Or request support from the neighboring sector command, which would take 26 hours and might result in the transport being captured entirely. Kess sat in the observation deck with Nolan, presenting the variables the way she might present a complex problem to her command staff, but without the pressure of authority. She laid out the mathematics: cargo loss versus crew casualties, immediate resource depletion versus cascading supply shortages, tactical solutions versus diplomatic escalation. What does your gut instinct tell you? Nolan asked. That I'm going to make a terrible decision, Kess replied. Any choice I make results in significant harm. The question is only which harm I can justify to myself and to the families of people affected by my choice. Nolan moved to the viewport and stood beside her, watching the distant stars with the same quiet focus she'd observed him using for weeks. I've been thinking about your neuroplant specimen, the one that grows stronger under conditions that should destroy it. The reason it survives is because the stress never exceeds its absolute breaking point. But what creates growth isn't just the stress itself. It's the recovery period between stress cycles. Without recovery time, even the most resilient organism eventually fails. Kess understood he wasn't talking about plants anymore. You're suggesting I need recovery time before making this decision? I'm suggesting that some decisions require perspective you can only get when you're not actively making other decisions, Nolan said. And I'm suggesting that you're more exhausted than you're willing to acknowledge, which means your decision-making process is currently operating at less than optimal capacity. I don't have the luxury of recovery time, Kess said. The transport is being actively pursued. Every hour delays a response. Then delegate, Nolan said simply. You have a command staff trained for exactly the situation. Give them the variables and let them propose solutions. Your job isn't to make every decision. Your job is to evaluate whether the decisions being proposed align with your strategic objectives and your moral framework. Kess was quiet for several minutes, processing this perspective. Then she returned to her terminal and composed a message to her command staff, requesting immediate analysis of the 3 scenarios and recommendations for response. Within 2 hours, her staff had synthesized the available data and recommended deploying the frigate despite its maintenance status, calculating that the incomplete repairs presented acceptable risk compared to the certainty of cargo loss if the transport attempted independent evasion. Kess reviewed the recommendation, verified the calculations, and authorized the deployment. The frigate departed within 4 hours. The transport was successfully intercepted and protected. The cargo was delivered within acceptable timeline parameters. When the mission report came through 18 hours later, it noted 0 crew casualties and confirmed successful cargo delivery. Kess received the update while standing in the observation deck with Nolan, watching a resupply vessel dock with the station. Your staff made an excellent tactical decision, Nolan observed. I authorized the frigate to depart with incomplete maintenance systems, Kess corrected. If the tactical situation had been slightly different, that frigate could have been destroyed. The crew could have died. But they didn't, Nolan said, because you trusted your staff to make a recommendation, and because they were well-trained enough to make the right choice. That's not delegating responsibility. That's distributing it among people capable of handling it, which is, incidentally, what good command actually looks like. Kess considered this. When did you become an expert in military strategy? I'm not, Nolan said, but I spent 20 years observing how pressure either grows people into their potential or breaks them into smaller pieces. And I've noticed that the officers who don't break are the ones who remember that distributed responsibility isn't the same as abandoned responsibility. They stood together in their usual positions, neither quite facing each other, both watching the station operations through the viewport. After another hour of companionable silence, Nolan began packing his equipment with practiced efficiency. The neurospecimen had completed its current growth cycle and needed to be transferred back to the botanical garden for the next phase of his research. Nolan, Kess said, the first time she'd used his first name in direct address. Thank you for sitting with me, for not trying to fix the problems, for just being present while I worked through them. Nolan smiled, the first completely genuine expression he'd offered in weeks. Thank you for trusting me with the space beside you. Weeks became months, and the observation deck evolved from sanctuary into something more like home. Nolan continued his botanical research, but he conducted his most meaningful work in the observation deck now, his specimens arranged in positions that caught the starlight in ways that seemed to accelerate their unusual growth patterns. Kess continued her command duties, but she delegated more frequently and trusted her staff with greater authority, discovering that distributed decision-making created more resilient outcomes than centralized command. They developed a kind of shorthand, 2 people who had spent enough time in shared silence to communicate effectively with minimal words. Nolan would mention a botanical observation that actually addressed command strategy. Kess would ask a question that seemed to be about plant resilience but was actually about officer development. The conversations happened in the gaps between their parallel work, neither of them interrupting the peaceful rhythm that had become precious to both. On the day Nolan received notice of his transfer to the Central Research Facility on New Meridian, he brought the original neurospecimen to the observation deck one final time. The plan had developed a remarkable structure, its growth pattern suggesting that stress and recovery cycles had created something far more resilient than a protected specimen in ideal conditions would ever become. "It's beautiful," Kess observed, examining the complex root system that had developed to survive low-nutrient conditions. "It survived," Nolan corrected gently, "which isn't always the same as beautiful, though sometimes the two overlap. The adaptation that allows it to thrive in difficult conditions also prevents it from reaching the full potential it might achieve in ideal circumstances. It's not better or worse than other plants. It's just specialized for a particular kind of environment. Will you transplant it to ideal conditions?" Kess asked. "No," Nolan said. "The adaptation is too fundamental. Change the environment too drastically, and it would likely fail. It needs the specific conditions that created it to continue functioning optimally. But I'll ensure it gets good maintenance and plenty of recovery time between growth cycles." They stood together in the observation deck one final time, watching the departure preparations for the transport that would take Nolan away from Archon Station. The silence between them held the weight of months spent in shared understanding, the accumulated trust that came from choosing to exist in each other's presence without demands or expectations. "The observation deck will miss you," Kess said. "The observation deck will do fine," Nolan replied. "So will you. You've grown past the stage where you needed someone just to sit with you. You're becoming the kind of commander who remembers that other people are resilient because she is. That's not a small thing." Kess removed her rank insignia with deliberate care, setting the small metal symbol on the maintenance table beside the nearest specimen. It was a violation of protocol, a small rebellion, a statement of who she actually was beneath the uniform that defined her in the eyes of most station personnel. "Then let me say this as Kess, not as Captain Vander," she said. "You taught me that wisdom isn't about making perfect decisions. It's about carrying the weight of imperfect decisions correctly. And you did that by simply sitting with me in a place where I could exist without performing anything. That matters more than I have words for." Nolan smiled, understanding that this was how they would say goodbye, through quiet acknowledgement rather than grand declarations, through the understanding that sometimes the most important thing you could do for another person was simply offer them the space to breathe. "See you around, Kess," he said as she prepared to leave the observation deck. "Not likely," she replied, her tone carrying affection. "The galaxy is large, and we move in different directions. But this moment, this particular conversation in this particular place with this particular person, that happened exactly as it should have. I'll carry it." "As I will," Nolan said. Kess returned to the observation deck 3 days after Nolan's departure, finding it exactly as it had been, the maintenance table clear of botanical equipment, the stars visible through the viewport exactly as before. But something fundamental had shifted in the space, as if the composition of the observation deck itself had changed based on who occupied it. She stood at her usual position and realized that Nolan had left the newer specimen on the maintenance table with a small data chip attached. The chip contained detailed botanical notes, not a gift, but a trust, records of the plant's entire growth cycle, the variables that had created its unique resilience, the observation methods that would allow someone else to continue his research if they had the patience and skill. Kess understood that she was being offered the choice to either maintain the plant independently or pass it along to someone else in the botanical department. It was such a perfect expression of how Nolan treated relationships, offering contribution without expectation, providing tools and perspective, but allowing the other person to determine their own subsequent direction. She carried the newer specimen back to her quarters and set it in a position where it received adequate indirect light. Then she began reading through Nolan's notes, discovering not just botanical data, but observations about stress, resilience, adaptation, and a particular kind of growth that emerged from conditions that should have been fatal. Every entry concluded with the same notation: recovery time essential. Growth requires both challenge and respite. Kess understood that he'd left the botanical equivalent of meditation, a living reminder of principles they discussed in companionable silence. The plan would require maintenance, would need be observed and cared for, would demand that she occasionally pause in her command duties to ensure its conditions remained optimal. It was, she realized, the perfect representation of what Nolan had taught her about distributed responsibility and self-care. The observation deck had been their shared sanctuary, but the neuroplant was something different. It was a private acknowledgement that some of what Nolan had offered her didn't disappear when he departed. It persisted in her choices and how she led, in her willingness to occasionally step back from the burden of command and allow recovery time, just as a resilient plant required both stress and respite to achieve a particular form of strength. Months later, when a new staff officer joined the station and Kes found herself mentoring the young captain through a series of ethically complex decisions, she mentioned the observation deck. When the captain's expression suggested that the weight of command was becoming unbearable, Kes invited her to visit the observation deck on a specific day and time when Kes happened to be there, conducting non-urgent administrative work. They didn't speak much. Instead, Kes arranged for the neurospecimen to be temporarily transferred to the observation deck's maintenance station, creating the same parallel arrangement she'd once shared with Nolan. Two people occupying the same space with their own legitimate work, offering presence rather than advice, providing silence rather than solutions. The captain initially seemed uncertain about the arrangement, but gradually she understood that the observation deck was being offered as sanctuary, that the shared silence was itself a form of wisdom, and that sometimes the most valuable mentorship looked less like instruction and more like partnership in bearing weight. As Kes watched the young captain begin to relax slightly, shoulders settling from the rigid posture of command into something marginally less defensive, she realized that Nolan's greatest contribution hadn't been teaching her how to make better decisions. It had been teaching her that the ability to offer space for another person to exist without performance, without judgment, without constant verification of worth. That was itself a form of leadership more valuable than tactical brilliance. The observation deck remained as it always was. Stars rotating in their perpetual patterns, the life support systems maintaining optimal conditions for organic existence, the viewport framing the vast indifference of space. But within that constancy, something had shifted. The space itself had learned to hold people gently, to offer them a particular kind of peace that came from being witnessed without being scrutinized, from existing beside another person without demands or expectations. And in a military station built on hierarchy, judgment, and the constant pressure of impossible decisions, that particular peace felt like the most revolutionary thing either captain or scientist could have discovered.